Most Pokemon are terrible competitively and fall out of use after just one generation. On the other hand, there are Pokemon that are just always good. But why? And to find out the answer, we'll of course be looking at examples of long-standing elite Pokemon. But before we do that, obviously we need to define what we mean by good. When we say good, we're not talking about some permanent standard of remaining a fixture in standard play. Even Zapdos, which is OU in both Gens 1 and 9, was UU in Gen 5. We also know the tragedy of Tyranitar, though that one was greatly assisted by the gutting of one of its most important weapons, Pursuit. Even when Zapdos and Tyranitar were below OU though, they were still good Pokemon. OU status is not the end-all be-all of a Pokemon's functionality. Just ask Gastrodon and Quagsire, regularly rising from the depths as low as PU to take on major threats in OU and even in Ubers. What we're looking at here is what makes a Pokemon fundamentally good, a collection of traits that ensure that pretty much no matter where it ends up, it's going to be useful. Think of it like this: what this Pokemon does is just about always good. It might not remain OU forever, but it's still good. Heatran can't hack it in standard play anymore, but it's still Heatran, and that is a great asset, as demonstrated by its excellence in UU, as well as the fact that it retains a legitimately decent OU niche. We must instill a cutoff though, and for our purposes here, we'll stick with UU. Originally, the only tiers were Ubers, OU, and UU, and a new gen's UU looking like a previous generation's OU has repeated and embedded itself in the competitive consciousness to the point of cliche. It's generally close enough to OU that, considering power creep, it seems fair to include it. And also because if we don't have these parameters, there would basically be no permanently good Pokemon at this point, at least not in Gen 9. This video isn't really a study of why certain Pokemon remain so good for so long though. We'll certainly be using the examples of several long-standing staples, but it's not about the specifics of Volcarona or Ferrothor or Clefable or what have you, so much as it is their impact on the game. What do we mean by this? Consider what comprises a Pokemon: stats, typing, ability, move pool, and a held item. Of course, no Pokemon is an island, and it exists in relation to its teammates and the metagame and whatnot. But ultimately, their impact on the game comes from the ability to switch into battle and make progress in the game state, or in other words, make its presence felt. So where does this impact of the game come from? Basically, when you switch into battle, what are you doing? Think of the most effective strategies. The easiest, simplest example: entry hazards. You spend one turn setting up Stealth Rock, and suddenly every Pokemon on the opposing team without Magic Guard or Heavy Duty Boots, and remember, there are 4 generations with rocks and no boots, is taking damage upon switching in a game centered around switching. Some Pokemon take ridiculous amounts of damage from rocks, but even the Pokemon that quad resist rock are impacted by it, and the rocks won't go away unless your opponent goes out of their way to remove them. Of course, you can accentuate rocks with other hazards. And not every strategy necessarily even involves making moves. Sometimes tactics like Intimidate, Regenerator, Flame Body, and Rocky Helmet mean you can switch around offensive Pokemon and let them beat themselves without actually damaging them directly. This is still impact. A Kartana paralyzed by Zapdos' static is ruined, for example. And we've mentioned hazards, certain abilities, and an item and a pivoting playstyle, but there's also switch moves, and among the most powerful in the game, trapping abilities, which by virtue of undoing the switching that is core to the game, are often considered broken. Passive damage of all sorts, from weather to status to Leech Seed to Ferrothor's Iron Barbs. There's phasing moves, which can be used defensively and offensively, taunts, multifaceted stifling of non-damaging moves, which are many and major, and of course there's boosting moves, where one shift gear and your Magearna might just destroy everything in sight, or maybe you prefer the slow burn of Calm Mind Reuniclus that wins a long game. Whatever the strategy is, you now see how this sort of impact is so key. It's why a Pokemon carrying the moves Knock Off and U-Turn is almost guaranteed to do something good on a game-to-game basis, simply because of how all-encompassing and excellent those moves are. So the most fundamentally strong Pokemon are the ones that carry the greatest impact, meaning both the impact that elicits the strongest effect in the game and the widest range of how it can affect the game. With this in mind, we can see why our first example of Zapdos has had such longevity. But before we get into that, this video is sponsored by the best in mattresses, Helix Sleep. Helix Sleep's mattresses are on par with some resort beds that I've slept on. And that's because this mattress was matched with me via Helix's sleep quiz. My partner and I both took the quiz, and they sent us a mattress that is perfect for us. We received the Helix Midnight. This mattress is great for me because I'm a back sleeper, as I specified on the quiz, and I also have back problems, so I can't sleep on something too soft or my body will sink too far in and hurt my back. Luckily, the Helix Midnight is the perfect firmness goodness for me. The mattress comes rolled up and compressed as a box, and it's very easy to set up. Like literally you just unwrap it on the bed and watch it decompress and form. Helix was even kind enough to send us a mattress with Glaciotech's cooling cover, which keeps us cool and comfortable while we sleep. I especially love this feature because for years I've had to deal with memory foam mattresses absorbing my body heat and the heat waking me up. Now I can safely say I do not experience that. The Helix lineup offers 20 unique mattresses, including their award-winning Luxe and Ultra Premium Elite collections. And the best part about all of this is that Helix has a 100-night sleep trial, so you get to use it for over 3 months for free to make sure you love it. So if you want the most comfortable mattresses ever and support the channel to help us produce more content, click the link in the description below to get an exclusive offer of 25% off. And thank you so much to Helix Sleep for sponsoring this video. In a nutshell, Zapdos doesn't seem that incredible. Its stats are very good, but not world crushers. It's not permanently walling everything in sight. It's strong, but not so ridiculously strong. Its speed is good, but almost quaint at this point. Its move pool is good, but it's not threatening incredible game-ending sweeps. However, look at how impactful Zapdos is. It doesn't need to be mega tier for its stats to be deceptively excellent. It's not good across the board, but indeed excellent when you look at its functioning. Its bulk and typing means it gets to wield some of the most effective resists in the game defensively, while its special attack and speed means it threatens opponents back effectively as well. It leaves impact on the game on both offense and defense. It's got vicious stab alongside heatwave coverage, and the fact that it doesn't get worn down due to natural bulk and recovery from roost also reinforces its defensive variants, who are often tasked with hazard removal in the fog. Zapdos also has Stab Vault Swish, one of the best pivoting moves in the game. It's got 2 tremendous abilities. Pressure helps it deplete Stealth Rock PP before it runs out of the fogs, making it uniquely excellent at pressuring Stealth Rockers, much like a Rapid Spinner might, thus bypassing one of the greatest flaws most defoggers have. Of course, Zapdos might also use a similar trick in using pressure to help deplete opposing defog PP. Then there's Static, whose punishment of contact moves is among Zapdos' greatest weapons and is responsible for a massive uptick in Heal Bell usage of Mega Lopunny, and in Gen 8, Dragonite. Basically, Zapdos has it all. We already mentioned its stats, its ability, and its move pool. They're all impactful. Then there's the matter of Zapdos' incredible typing. It's an electric immune to Earthquake, which makes it great defensively and offensively. Being a flying type tends to be quite excellent in general, so long as the other type is great. Not everything can be Tornadus, and that's very much the case with the electric pairing. In Gens 8 and 9, even the item slot improved for it thanks to its boots. Not that it wasn't excellent at using leftovers or Rocky Helmet before, of course, or sometimes even choice specs in Gen 4 OU. In this regard, the same concepts haven't always applied, so it might seem weird to make such comparisons when mechanics might change across a generation. Think of essential aspects of the game not just today, but for the past several generations, and then think of how in the earliest days it didn't exist at all. Much of what makes Zapdos elite today didn't exist in the first 2 generations. There is no entry hazard sub-metagame in Gen 1 OU. Nobody is using Levitate to hover above spikes in Gen 2. Snorlax had one of the biggest drop-offs from its peerless start in these 2 generations. However, the game has roughly applied the same principles since Generation 3, which is why that is the earliest gen that is still fundamentally recognizable to newer players. These principles come from the split EV system. The first 2 generations had every stat maxed out with 252 EVs, but in Gen 3, the 508 max EV system limit came around, which changed the game enormously. Furthermore, Gen 3 added abilities, and generally, though the mechanics have been tweaked since then, they are largely recognizable. It still might seem strange to a new player with things like permanent sandstorm, no stealth rock, and 12.5% burn damage, but the general principles like Celebi natural curing off opposing status and throwing around leech seeds, or Salamence's intimidate weakening physical attacks, or not weakening them in the case of Metagross and its clear body, generally makes sense in comparison to the complete alien planets that are Gens 2 and especially 1, with their lack of abilities and unique mechanics like Gen 1 crit rates and Gen 2 phasing that truly seem beamed from another dimension. Now, if you really wanted to be accurate, you could say that Gen 4 is the first quote-unquote modern generation, because that also changed things enormously with the introduction of the physical special split, which really makes things familiar. But then you can say that Gen 5 and its introduction of Team Preview, which by the way was despised on release, also made things modern. Heck, you could say Gen 6 with its fairy types really are where the game comes into its so-called modern state, especially with with its host of additional mechanic changes that really altered the game, like a buff defog and knockoff, lack of permanent weather, weakened base powers of significant moves like Draco Meteor, Hydro Pump, and Thunderbolt, etc. There are legitimate cases for all of these. However, across all these generations, the Pokemon that are fundamentally always good are remarkably consistent, and that's why we mention Gen 3 as a sort of starting point. This is where the game became similar enough to the game that we know today. So basically, we're not investigating Tauros situations, where if the mechanics had never changed so ridiculously drastically, Tauros would have been amazing much longer. If you ask someone playing during Gen 2 if Snorlax would ever become bad, they would laugh at you. But jokes about Garchomp falling off in some far-off gen have been around forever, knowingly accurate despite how wild it seemed to imagine at the times of Gens 4 and 5. Of course, this is not an ideal system, and it's not likely Latios would have taken that hit it did without the Fairy type completely upending its endlessly spammable Draco Meteor deal, and with the nerf to its base power to boot. Indeed, those were mechanics changes affecting it, but it generally works for what we're going for here. So there is a difference between something that was good for its generation at the time, since we're starting at Gen 3, look at how Aerodactyl is an elite tier staple, and something whose Pokemon fundamentals, as developed by the system put in place by Gen 3, are so solid as to make them always good. Not specifically suited at a certain time and place, but rather suitable for almost any time and place. Aerodactyl's history post Gen 3 is a world of difference from fellow Gen 3 OU staples Tyranitar, Skarmory, and Zapdos, because their traits are more robust overall. Effectively, their impact has to be so powerfully cross-generational as to be an essential part of the battling system. For instance, so long as switching is an important part of competitive Pokemon, it could be argued that switching is competitive Pokemon. Tactics like Regenerator will be incredibly effective, so long as they're on good Pokemon, of course. Regenerator Magikarp wouldn't exactly take OU by storm. So now we're going to look at some of the Pokemon who are most impactful for their combined traits that make them so fundamentally good. It's well known that some players complain that standards are spammed too much, and the world is full of Landorus Therian. And it's also quite known that Landorus Therian is spammed so much because it seems like it counters everything. In Gen 8, it even turned itself into a special wall. Basically, put those together and you'll have what we're looking for. The Pokemon that are so fundamentally good because they seem to counter everything, not just by switching into things, but by what they do afterwards. Lando T wouldn't be nearly as impressive without its wide array of Stealth Rock, U-Turn, Sap, Earthquake, and many others. And another way to think about it, in Gen 6 and 7, every Ubers team has Primal Groudon because it's basically perfect. You cannot find anything better than Primal Groudon. Why wouldn't you use it? OU tends to not have that level of mandatory Pokemon anymore. Not post Gen 2 Snorlax, but you're always looking for that kind of Pokemon. The kind that's so good that it doesn't matter your opponent knows it's coming. It's going to get the job done anyway. But to be able to do that across generations, that's what we're looking for here. And nothing is more representative of longevity than a Steel Wall. Steel Flying is one of the most incredible defensive types in the game, lauded since the days of Generation 2. Skarmory seems to be able to withstand anything. Power Creep, Magnet Pull, Defog, Heavy Duty Boots, never mind all that. Skarmory always finds a way to wall and spike. Well, sometimes it can defog as well, and sometimes it can both spike and defog, but mostly it's all about spikes. Oh, it can Stealth Rock as well, but again, mostly spikes. It does this because Steel is an extraordinary defensive type, even after losing its Ghost and Dark resist. The gain Fairy resist sure is nice, and because Flying is also an excellent defensive type, and the two complement each other beautifully, a Steel neutral to fighting and immune to ground, well, sign us up. Only two weaknesses in Fire and Electric. A Flyer neutral to Ice is excellent too. The typing gives you the opportunity for the stats and moves to carry, and boy do they carry. Skarmory is the poster Pokemon for spikes, a move that has had campaigns to ban it across many generations. It doesn't just spike either, it makes you feel the full force of spike through its whirlwinds. Skarmory is UU now, where it's great, and is still solid in OU, and can even be used in Ubers. Our next Steel and Flying type is Salicila, who isn't spiking, but it sure is wielding that typing to tremendous effect as well. It's the most openly offensive of the three, with strong stab, heavy slam threatening fairy types greatly, as well as solid general damage output, and it's joined by the beauty of flamethrower coverage, so you can forget about walling it with your own steel. This isn't to downplay its bulk though, which is superb on both sides of the spectrum. Where the impact really comes in though is Leech Seed, one of the most amazing moves in the game on the right Pokemon. It's almost always on grass types, but giving Leech Seed to a pseudo Skarmory sounds incredible, and in practice it's especially incredible, especially since that flamethrower coverage also ensures grass types like Ferrothorn aren't going to be able to block your Leech Seed safely, nor can Magic Guard Clefable do so, not unless it wants to risk getting hammered by a Heavy Slam. Celesteela towered over OU in Gen 7 and rocked UU in Gen 8. Celesteela was also one of the most dominant walls in VGC, a tier that generally doesn't do walling that much, but when it combined its incredible hit taking with how quickly it drained your health between Leech Seed and its attacks, you didn't exactly have time to try and break through it, to say nothing of how Leech Seed reinforced its already superb walling. Finally, our third Steel Flying type, Corviknight, is the most passive of the three, without anything quite impactful as Spikes or Leech Seed, but if you want momentum, it uses that incredible typing to enable entry so that it can U-turn with the best of them, while both its physical and special bulk are excellent as well. It thrives much like Zapdos thanks to the fog backed by pressure. From there, it's got a host of other ways that it can make its presence felt beyond U-turn to enable its teammates. Taunt is a superb move, but is mostly about the Iron Defense body press combination that doesn't just make its defense impenetrable, but makes it a threat to sweep to boot. It's wielded its bulk and tremendous typing en route to becoming an OU fixture over the past 2 generations. And with that, we are moving on from flying types. Just kidding. We devoted a video to this duel when we discussed the best typing in the game in singles, so we won't rehash it much here, but ultimately, their typing is so good that it is basically an ideal of Pokemon. Its resistances and neutralities alike are fundamentally so superb in allowing their stats and move pool, including the ever-trusty Stab Earthquake to take on a gigantic swath of opposing threats. Gliscor just keeps improving, in fact, having spent a chunk of Gen 9 in Ubers, a tier that it also excels in. Meanwhile, Lando T being an all-checking OU staple seems like a fact of life at this point. No matter how much ice coverage you try to throw at these two, they just keep on trucking. Landorus Therian was also, of course, one of the most important Pokemon in VGC, equally iconic for its incredible spam ability there as in singles, because Intimidate is doubly useful, Stab Earthquake is an incredible spread move, and well, that ground flying typing seems to let it take on almost everything. And speaking of take on almost everything, there are some Pokemon that can take on even hazards. Competitive Pokemon is about switching. Hazards punish switching. How do you deal with hazards? You either go the removal route, the effective yet reactive and thus exploitable routes of Rapid Spin and Defog, until you face Goldango anyway, or you exert pressure, taunt, magic bounce, offensive pressure, and in many generations, sleep. But no matter what you do though, it can tend to be a major uphill struggle. That's why Clefable and Alakazam are so useful. All that effort you put into littering the field with Stealth Rock, 3 layers of spikes, and 2 layers of Toxic Spikes, they don't care. Clefable has been OU since Gen 6, which is astonishing considering how its stats aren't particularly impressive even by Gen 3 standards. It's also so good in Gen 4, many players want it banned, and there it's a normal type with almost no useful resist. It's UU in Gen 4, but that's because it didn't rise to prominence until after the generation ended, and there was no reason to upend the UU metagame. Make no mistake though, if tearing had remained active, Clefable would have risen to OU years ago. It's consistently at the top of the usage stats in high level play. It even became genuinely excellent in Ubers. Oh, and it also established a genuinely excellent niche for itself in Gen 5 OU, despite the power creep, while really not having any resist to speak of there. At least its Shadow Ball immunity could be quite helpful in Gen 4. Gen 6 and on though, it's defied power creep, despite barely ever having any power itself. Magic Guard almost single-handedly carries it to this day, where its ability to perpetually stay healthy in the face of hazard spam allows it to be a wall in an age where the concept of walling is constantly thrown into question. Hazards are so impactful, we regularly question how healthy they are. And then there's Clefable, whose impact is ignoring them entirely, as well as all the other burns and toxics and sand and leech seed toss every which way. Alakazam's approach to Magic Guard spam is different. At its peak in Gen 5, where the built-in Focus Sash allowed it to revenge kill anything, and alongside its tier best speed, allowed it to take on the role somewhat akin to a Choice Scarfer, except without the momentum-losing move block, instead providing one of the scariest wall breakers around. Its counters tended to get shattered by hazards, while Alakazam itself was immune to them. This made it incredibly easy to outlast them, except unlike the approach taken by Clefable, Alakazam didn't just wait them out passively. It made that timer tick fast from how quickly it became nigh impossible to counter with hazards in the picture, all while not getting worn down itself, thus bypassing the flaws of its frailty. The fact that it didn't get worn down also allowed it to wield a recoil-free Life Orb. Forget pivoting around its moves to let it wear itself down, as was made famous against Infernape in its Gen 4 heyday. Nope, Alakazam is just hammering away at you. Clefable also could wield Life Orb to great effect, but on a Pokemon of Zam's strength and speed, it was particularly terrifying. In addition to ruling over Gen 5 OU so hard it prompted unprecedented rule changes and had consistent screens for its ban, it also completely owned Gen 6 and 7 UU to hilarious extents. Magikarp is truly a powerful ability when switching, just like Regenerator. We've mentioned Slowbro, Slowking, and Galarian Slowking's Regenerator antics on this channel before, so we'll only do a cursory gesture here, especially because of how overlooked these other Regenerators are. Tornadus Therian is most renowned for using Regenerator to brutal offensive ends in Gen 5, where the few answers to its perma-drizzle-fueled Hurricane would collapse by virtue of the fact that it U-turn out and never fall prey to Stealth Rock, despite being weak to it, thanks to Regenerator. And even the sturdiest teams struggle to withstand a rock-weak Life Orb Pokemon, hitting them over and over and over, or a Choice Specs one for that matter. Tornadus T got banned in Gen 5, but then Gen 6 came around, goodbye Permadrizzle, and have a weakened Hurricane while you're at it. Here, Tornadus Therian reinvented itself as a form of incredible utility, wielding the uniqueness and effectiveness of its pure flying typing, proving that yes, knockoff and U-turn also tend to get you pretty close to winning games too, providing that you get to use them repeatedly, as Regenerator allows it to do. Mean Shao would also use this to superb effect in several tiers. Tornadus Therian also became a key defensive piece, with Gen 6's Assault Vest letting it devour special hits like Superior's Leaf Storm, or Gen 7's Rocky Helmet letting it punish physical hits like Cortana's Leaf Blade, and then Gen 6 adopting Rocky Helmet tactics and punishing all manner of Pokemon while also opening up its ability to use Taunt. In Gen 7, Tornadus T also excelled at defogging, and while it was a hit taker, it wasn't a pure wall. It was so impactful because, in a manner akin to Gen 2 Raikou, right down to the 70% accurate stab in many cases, it both took hits and tended to outspeed the Pokemon dishing them out, which allowed it to strike back with ease, Hurricane accuracy willing anyways. In Gen 7, it could even bypass Hurricane accuracy just once with Flynium Z, making it quite a forceful offensive presence in addition to defensive utility. And then in Gen 8, it really became scary with the addition of Nasty Plot, and especially heavy duty boots for any set. Suddenly, even Stealth Rock couldn't stop it, and it really regenerated just about every hit off. Another Regenerator is Tangrowth, who is less flashy in how it did its job. After all, it tended to be quote-unquote just a bulky grass type, with tools like Sleep and Knockoff and Leech Seed and even Worry Seed to really ruin Poison Heal Gliscor. It's not explosive, but oh boy, upon gaining Regenerator in Gen 5, it did its job so well. It took on some of the scariest Pokemon in the game. Sandrush, Excadrill, and Permanent Sand was the biggest one, and it did so repeatedly. No matter how you hit it, it'd take the hit and still be in great shape to take your hits again later, and demonstrated this with its superb OE status in Gen 6 and 7, countering even the beast that was Mega Metagross, and with Assault Vest, it became a special hit taker that answered the likes of Ash Greninja. In Gen 8, it thrived in UU, but there it was also a force in Ubers, often used to play around the likes of Zacian Crown of all things, repeatedly leveraging Regenerator and its bulk to punish it through Rocky Helmet. And the last of our Regenerators, we'd like to mention Alomomola, which was NU and RU in its first two generations, despite OU niches, especially in Gen 6, which it ruled over at one point in XY, but it's only gotten better, becoming UU in Gen 7 and OU in the most power crept gen of all, 9, having gained another high impact move in Flip Turn. So in conclusion, in many metagames, you can often make good or even great teams almost without even worrying about synergy. Of course you do, but in many cases, you can just take the best Pokemon and have a perfectly strong team, especially because such Pokemon are so overall good. They have that quote-unquote beat everything effect. The big moves, hazards and switch moves, abilities like trapping, and those that we've listed, the big stats of course, and the essential types. Steel, ground, water, grass, fairy, ghost, basically the kind of stuff that carries you through battle almost without thought. Think of how hazards were so strong in Gen 5 that Deoxys speed and defense were both banned for being too good at sacrificing themselves to get them. Of course, we could have listed many other Pokemon, but these were just a few that illustrated the concepts behind this video. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Pretzel SP, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos.